and welcome to Her Path Podcast, the podcast for busy women looking for health, happiness, and purpose. Today, we're diving into the profound wisdom of nature and how it can help us guide us in health, balance, and finding our way when life feels overwhelming. So, have you ever noticed how nature always seems to know just what to do? It doesn't try, it doesn't force, it just simply is. Today, we'll explore what we can learn from the trees, the rivers, and the changing seasons, and how these lessons can help us thrive. Nature's always been my go-to when I feel stuck, and I'm excited to share its wisdom with you today. To start, I'm going to share a little moment from my life when I turned to nature for answers. I live on a small river, and one day I was just feeling a bit overwhelmed. It was last summer. I was overwhelmed and frustrated, and I took a chair and sat by the river. And I just sat and observed, and aloud, I gave my situation up for contemplation. When I sat by the river and emptied my mind, just watched it, I came away with some really good insights. One is go with the flow because the river doesn't resist obstacles. When it encounters a rock, it just flows around it, finding another path, which reminds us to adapt and stay flexible when challenges arise because resistance creates stress, but flow allows us to move forward with more grace. Another is to trust the journey because a river's destination is often far away, but it doesn't rush or worry about reaching it. It takes its time, it carves its path patiently. It teaches us to trust our own journey, even when we can't see the end result. And rivers are always moving, so that's like change, changing shape, creating new paths. It reminds us that change is a natural part of life. Stagnation is not our natural state, growth and movement are. And then some parts of a river push forward where others are deep and calm. This duality shows us that life isn't always about actions. There's times when we need to move quickly, and there's times when we need to pause and just be. The river doesn't exist in isolation. It's fed by streams and tributaries. It nourishes the land it touches, and we're all connected, and our relationships and contributions are important. So, one of the most beautiful lessons I think we can learn from nature is it doesn't try, it just is. If you look at an oak tree, it grows into its potential, but not because it forces itself to grow big and grand, because that's just what it's meant to do. It follows its genetic code. It doesn't worry about being as tall as a redwood or as colorful as a maple. It doesn't play small or question its place in the forest. An oak tree doesn't say, oh, I shouldn't grow too tall because it might upset the birch tree. It just grows. And yet, every tree in the forest plays a unique and essential role. Oak trees provide shelter and shade for smaller plants. Smaller trees create diversity and fill in the space between. And when trees fall, they serve by nourishing the soil, by decomposing and support new growth. And as humans, we often compare ourselves to others or hold ourselves back, fearing judgment or failure. And nature does not do that. It reminds us we're all here to grow into our fullness. Somebody else's grandness doesn't diminish our own, it's part of the balance. Do you guys have anything you can add to this?
I think I take nature for granted a lot. I'll be honest with you. I I'm in the city. I'm in Dallas, surrounded by, buildings, traffic, pollution, noise all the time, sirens, helicopters, airplanes. And it probably wasn't until recently, like when my husband got into, so my husband likes to do birding, and I know I've talked to you all about the birding.
Mm-hmm.
And it was during the pandemic where things kind of shut down, slowed down forcefully, and we just had more time to be in our environment. It was just our yard. And taking that time to just be there and observe and watch, I didn't realize that we had so many different types of birds just, in our yard, and beautifully colored, red ones, blue ones, multicolored. I only noticed like the loud black crows and heard some tweeting, but didn't really differentiate between the different chirps, the different songs, the different sounds, the different flutterings, in the bushes or the trees until we were forced to slow down, until we were forced to figure out other ways to pass the time other than being super busy and super involved in the goings and the comings of going to work and coming back and all of the structured things. And I really realized that there is so much peace and beauty around us that we really take for granted. But if we weren't forced to stop and listen, I don't think I would have ever realized that or seen that. And so that is something that, I have tried ever since then to try to apply, to myself and my personal life, is to slow down and appreciate, your surrounding, your environment, because there is so much beauty, there's so much meaning, there is so much more that you can miss. And it happens in an instant. It's like a flutter. It's like that little song that you hear, or like that little fluttering in the bush. If you don't stop and not mindful of it, you miss so much. And time is really, really valuable. And so that's one thing that now I can appreciate about nature, is that time does seem to slow down. It does allow you to appreciate a lot of small things where before you would just take for granted.
Yeah, I feel like I've had a varied history with nature. So first of all, I love the ocean. I love, I live in Connecticut. We have we have the Sound, the Long Island Sound, which is ocean-ish. But going to New Hampshire has always been my favorite place. Just the ocean. I get to the ocean and my blood pressure drops 20 points.
Hmm.
it's just my place. I will say that during the pandemic, I was the planning chief for a large healthcare organization. So we worked 16 hours a day, sometimes more, for like 192 days straight. And when there was a little break, I would grab my family and we would go to just a trail. We'd use the All Trails app, and there are trails all over the place, and we would hike. And taking these little hikes really made us all look at nature differently. And it was a chance to be outside.
Mhm.
It was safe. It was with our family. It was exercise. And I just really appreciated those little brief breaks from managing COVID in my household, managing COVID at a major healthcare, organization. It was a lot. So fast forward to this year, I think I've mentioned on this podcast that we've had quite a bit of loss in our family. And I have found that when I get overwhelmed with the thoughts of loss, that I go outside. And even now, and I live in the Northeast and it's cold, I find that going outside in the crisp and coldness is very clarifying for me. It just settles me. I look up. I try and make sure I'm looking up at the sky. I'm looking up at the moon. I'm looking for the birds or whatever. But just being outside is very settling. But that's a new development for me. And I love
Yeah,
all the
I
peace. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I love the ocean too. And I grew up in Northern California, so it wasn't too far away. And being here in middle of the city, the closest we can get to is the Texas coast. And while the beach is not as beautiful as in some other more exotic places, but there is still something about standing there on the shore, hearing the waves, the rhythm of the sound of the waves, and then
Yeah.
looking at that expanse of endless ocean and seeing the horizon. Um, for me, when I'm, you know, actually have time to go and experience it and have that time to kind of look and stop and think, um, like like Nancy was saying earlier, it's nature just exists and it doesn't apologize. There's always movement and motion. And so I get that rhythm and that movement and the um that flow that happens, in the waves and then looking out into the horizon. It's kind of like sparks that what's out there, what's next. And it's like the antithesis or the opposite of stagnation, because what happens when something in nature stagnates? It rots, If you have a stagnant pool, it gets diseased, pests, it smells, it's awful. And you can internalize that and see and kind of compare to what happens with us when we stop, when we don't aspire, when we don't move, when we stop thinking or communicating is kind of like what happens in nature when something stagnates. It starts to rot and deteriorate. Um, and so I love that analogy that Nancy gave about nature being constantly in motion, constantly having a rhythm. Um, and we use that as like, to fall asleep as white noise in the background, the babbling the brooks, the
Yeah.
sound of the waves, the sound of the wind blowing, birds chirping. Those are all things for whatever reason. There's probably a scientific kind of, explanation
Mhm.
for it, but it helps calm the mind. Those natural
Yes.
rhythms, those natural sounds, have a relaxing and soothing effect on us that brings
Yeah.
down our cortisol, brings down our blood pressure, helps
Right.
shut the mind down.
Right. Right. I'm wondering, so there's so many people, so many women, working women who work in corporate or are in jobs where they're in offices or they're in hospitals or they're in courts or whatever, and they can't get out during the day or it's hard to get out. And I think about that now that I have the luxury, as a coach, I'm sitting in this glass enclosed room. This is my office, and I can just walk right out the door to the outside and get some fresh air, get some sunshine, feel the wind, whatever. I'm wondering what the impact is to people who don't have the opportunity to go outside. And maybe, Gabby, that's even true for you. I mean, when you get in, aren't you just go, go, go until it's time to go?
Yeah, I thought so. I'm in a clinic. I'm a primary care doctor in an outpatient clinic. And I always thought I'm a really active person. I'm like always, walking back and forth to patient rooms. But when I really counted my steps, I mean, it was not a whole lot. It was like 2,000 steps, which, the ideal is to shoot for getting 10,000 steps a day. Um, so outside of, and I don't have any windows. I don't know if it's daytime, nighttime, is it raining? Is it hot or cold? I mean, constant this constant sterile kind of uniform environment year long. And it did when my hours were a little bit more hectic. It was a little depressing getting to work when it was dark and then leaving and it's still dark and not having that circadian kind of change from light to dark. And there's a really good book if anyone's interested in reading more about called The Circadian Code out there, about the importance of our biological clock or circadian rhythm and how it affects like every aspect of our function. And it's a really fascinating book. But
What was the
yeah,
name
so see
again?
the Circadian Code.
Code. Okay, great.
And I can't think of the author right now, but it's written by a medical doctor who's very I don't know if he's an endocrinologist or a neurologist, but anyway, someone who's a lot smarter than me, talking about how that circadian rhythm is so important, like in how we have switches, on and off switches, in our organs that really is dictated by, the natural cycle of the sun and the moons. It's super fascinating. And so we are a part of nature. That's what we come from, and separating ourselves from nature causes problems. I mean, look at the epidemic of vitamin D deficiency that we have in our community because of lack of exposure to sunlight, seasonal affective disorder. We get depressed in the darker months. So there is a lot of even data that shows that we definitely benefit from being outdoors and having that exposure to nature. But yeah, so for me, having a little bit more intention getting outside, I have my own little garden in my backyard in the middle of the city where I have a pond with goldfish and I have, an aquaponic system set up with the beautiful passion flower vines and some herbs growing in there. Juan and I do walks around the neighborhood, in the evenings and on the weekends. And luckily, we live in a community that has lots of mature trees. And so we admire the old trees. We, of course, try to recognize the birds that we hear and see. And so even though we're in the city and we're both enclosed all day long, we try to find ways to get connected to nature. And we get our exercise in, and it really is a wonderful way to de-stress.
So it's the Circadian Code, and it's by Sanchin Panda.
Oh, yes, you looked it
Yes.
up. Yes. It's an
Yes.
amazing. So I you can listen to it on on Audible or read it, but it goes along with a lot of things that we've talked about in this podcast, even about stress management, weight loss,
Yep.
the mood and how our circadian rhythm, our connection to light and dark, really can impact some of our basic biological functioning. So it's super fascinating.
And I think it's also a huge component to well-being and self-care, but it's often overlooked, right? So
Right.
when we think about well-being, it's about eating right and getting enough sleep and exercising. But I would challenge the thinking around that nature is such a critical part of self-care and well-being. I love that your husband is so into birds. We're kind of into birds over here too. I have right out this window, I have like a whole bunch of different bird feeders, a little bird sanctuary over here. And every time we travel, we bring little bird books with us of the area and, track the birds. But
Oh, yeah.
it really is such an important part of my well-being, and I do consider it part of self-care. Nancy, what do you think about that? I bet you're a big proponent of that.
Oh, I do. I even love going barefoot outside. Even in the snow, I let the dog out and I watched him and I thought, well, I'm just gonna go with my feet, not put any boots or anything on. And I just was on the ground and just feeling it. And even if it was cold, it was fine. I think
I
it's
could totally see you
huge.
doing that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I love it. I love being outside.
Yeah.
I love laying in the grass, looking at the clouds. I think it's so peaceful,
Hmm.
super grounding for
I
Yeah.
sure.
don't even mind. We have walking trails here in, near downtown Dallas, and there's high traffic in these walking trails because it goes through the city. It's very urban. And on the weekends, there's a lot of volume of people walking through the walking trails, like the Katy Trail or the Santa Fe Trail or the White Rock Lake Trail. Um, so it shows you that even in the city, people are still longing to connect
Mhm.
to nature, even if it is, some small trees in between tall buildings and, man-made nature, but being outside, feeling the wind, feeling the sun, um, even if not alone with some good company, can really help you de-stress, get some movement, some physical fitness in there.
Have you
And
guys, sorry, have you guys seen like well, they'll take like a wall and they'll grow like plants and things out of the walls?
yes, yes, I have so because my garden is small, Juan has half of the garden all full of chili plants. Like, I mean, they're just wild. They take over. And so we were having kind of an argument and how he was hogging up the whole garden and he wouldn't
Mm.
let me have.
Mhm.
So the other half of the garden is against the fence. So I'm going to do a vertical garden on the fence.
Nice.
Love it.
Um, mhm.
Nice.
And so, yeah, I'll let you know how it goes. Once the
Mm.
winter passes, once it gets to better weather.
Right, right, right.
And isn't there supposed to be, when you're gardening, when your hands are in the dirt, like a
Yes,
serotonin release? Like,
huge.
isn't, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, see,
I
I'm
don't
in
like
the dirt.
gardening gloves
Oh, really? You
I
like you
don't
like
wear
your
gardening gloves either.
hands
Yeah.
in the dirt.
to feel the weeds as I'm pulling them. Yeah, I
Yep.
like it. Absolutely.
Yeah, I am not a hands in the dirt kind of girl, but
No,
I feel like I've been reading a lot about the serotonin release in gardening, and I'm like, well, maybe I need to rethink this a little bit.
You should do
yeah.
it. It is really therapeutic. As long as you know that it's clean there. It's not where your doggy goes to do their business.
Yes, right.
Mhm.
Right.
Then it's not too bad at all.
Right. And there's so much coming out about that grounding. I think Nancy, you were talking about the grounding,
Yes,
your feet in the soil, your feet in the snow. You know, you actually lie in the grass, which I mean we used to do all the time as kids, and it's
I
funny that
know.
we don't do that as adults, and we
I
should.
know. Why not? Yeah, I love laying on the grass and looking up at the sky and looking at the clouds, and even at night going out with a blanket and laying down and looking at the stars and the moon. It's just so, I don't know, it's just so peaceful and sweet.
Yeah. And I think, you know, being very intentional and taking the time out to appreciate those moments can really lead to a deeper understanding um of of yourself and give you some time to reflect on the things that really are important. A lot of times we just rush, and it's just kind of like on autopilot, and we don't take the time to kind of just stop and reflect and think and breathe even.
Right.
I was kind of feeling like that the last couple of weeks, like when thinking about how this month is almost over, this year is pretty much over, and thinking, holy, you know,
Where did it
crap,
go?
I haven't, yeah, like
Yeah.
what have I haven't taken enough time to kind of stop and breathe and reflect and think and like re uh refocus myself into like the things that are really important.
Hmm.
And you know, I think about, you know, we all went to the life coach school, and the owner of the coach school, Brooke Castillo, she often talks about her walking, she doesn't call it a program, her walking practice is what she calls it. And
Right.
how one of the most important things is to have to, for her, was to live in an environment that had good walking spaces for her. So she moved somewhere and bought a beautiful place. And when they moved in, there was no place for her to walk.
Was
And
that the Miami place?
I think so. And she ended up moving after like 6 months because she couldn't handle not having a place to walk. And also, when she walks, she does not plug in. And she's very much a proponent of be with nature when you're walking. Don't plug in, you know, don't put your earpods in. And that's your time to think and process and meditate
Mhm.
and plan and just,
Mhm.
if you're plugged in and you're listening to a podcast or an audiobook or music, it's really hard to get that maximum benefit from being out in nature. And
Well, that's putting yourself on autopilot again. It's just
yeah,
like, okay, another thing to do, another thing to finish, another thing, you know,
you're right.
to accomplish sometimes. At least that's what I think for myself. When it's just like a habit I get into. Every time I get in the car, I got to put something on, listen to something, learn something. You know, another course, another book, another resource, you know, instead
Mhm.
of I think just this week, I think once this week, I'm like, I'm just going to drive in silence and, you
Mm.
know, enjoy the drive.
Mm-hmm.
That's funny. I live in silence. When I come home, I don't put anything on. And it's so quiet, but I can hear myself think.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I have a friend who she has the TV on all the time, and I'm like, all the time? She's like, yep, when I wake up. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I could never do that. I guess I like hearing my own thoughts.
Yeah. Well, and it's a skill, right? It's a muscle. You know, I think the first time you make that intention, I'm gonna just be with nature, or I'm gonna be with myself in silence. I think it
Hmm.
can be discomforting, right? It can be
Hmm.
uncomfortable, but you build it like you would a muscle. You just keep
Hmm.
doing it and keep practicing it. And now, like Nancy, you can't imagine another way of living.
Right, exactly. With my parents, they always had the TV on at night. It was 24/7.
Wow.
Made me insane.
Yeah.
So in my space, it's very quiet, very peaceful.
Good. Well, I think this has been a great conversation about nature and the power of nature for our bodies, for our souls, for our minds, for our well-being, for our self-care.
Mhm.
Nancy, thank you for bringing this topic up. It's not one that gets talked about a lot, but it's so, I just think it's so valuable. So we hope you all got some hints out of it and are gonna go outside and get closer to nature and um,
Just be.
Just be. Just be.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And if this was something that resonated with you, please share or like and follow us. We would greatly appreciate that. Have a good day, everyone.
Hey, one more thing before we leave. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. We are certified professional coaches, but this broadcast is not a substitute for medical or psychological advice. Okay, thanks for listening. See you next week.